1298. The Palazzo San Giorgio, Genoa. The first thing that assaults the senses is the cold. It is not the clean, sharp cold of a Venetian winter, but a damp, penetrating chill that seems to rise from the very stones of the fortress-turned-prison. A cold that seeps into the bones and carries with it the foul stench of the harbor's bilgewater, stale sweat, and human despair. The only light is a sliver of greasy gray that leaks through a high, barred window, illuminating a swirling universe of dust motes in the stagnant air. The dominant sound is the ceaseless, rhythmic lapping of water against the thick palace walls, a maddeningly gentle sound that speaks of a freedom just inches away but utterly unattainable. This gentle sound is punctuated by the distant, muffled shouts of Genoese sailors, the screech of gulls, and closer, the frantic scratching of rats in the walls. In the center of this miserable cell sits a man in his mid-40s, no longer young but with a fire still burning in his dark eyes, a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo, captured in a sea battle against his city's eternal rival. Opposite him, another man, a Pisan writer of romances named Rustichello, hunches over a crude wooden table. The only sound he makes is the furious scratching of his quill on parchment, a sound like a mouse gnawing on wood. He is a prisoner too, but tonight he is a conduit. He writes as Marco speaks, his voice a low, steady murmur against the symphony of decay, a voice that is not telling a story of captivity, but of unimaginable splendor. He speaks of palaces with roofs of solid gold, of cities with 12,000 bridges, of black stones that burn like wood, and of an emperor who commands millions from a throne of ivory. This is the genesis of the book that will change the world. A book born in darkness, a testament to a world of light, dictated by a man who will forever be known by two names: the greatest traveler in history and the greatest liar. This is the narrative of him, Marco Polo, the man who walked through the gates of paradise and returned to a world that refused to believe him. This was the saga of a Venetian merchant who became the confidant of the most powerful emperor on earth, who mapped a civilization that dwarfed his own in every conceivable way, and whose reward was to be branded a teller of tall tales, a purveyor of a million lies, il milione. The central dramatic paradox of his life is not that he journeyed 24 years across the known world, but that upon his return, the world he had known chose to shut its eyes. He brought back a key to a new reality, and his countrymen used it to lock him away in ridicule. So how did the son of a mercantile house, a boy from the labyrinthine canals of Venice, achieve this impossible feat? How did he penetrate the heart of the mighty Mongol Empire, witness wonders that defied belief, and what was it about his truth that was so blinding, so terrifying, that Europe preferred the comfort of its own ignorance? To understand the man, we must first return to the world that spawned him, a world teetering on the edge of a new age, a world of profound violence, fervent faith, and colossal, continent-spanning ambition. It was a world where a single journey could redraw the boundaries of reality, but only if people were willing to see. The tragedy of Marco Polo is that he was a man who could see in the dark, speaking to a world of the blind. To understand this man, we must return to the world of the mid-13th century, a geopolitical chessboard drenched in blood and trembling with change. This was not a stable world. It was a fractured, violent, and profoundly uncertain landscape. The grand, terrifying engine of the Mongol Empire, the machine that had carved a path of slaughter from the Pacific to the plains of Hungary under Genghis Khan, was beginning to sputter and fragment. The monolithic empire had been shattered into four great khanates: the Golden Horde looming over the Russian steppes, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Yuan dynasty ruling over China, and the Ilkhanate in Persia. This fragmentation, while a sign of internal decay, had an unintended consequence. It made the legendary Silk Road, for a time, safer for merchants than it had been in centuries under the so-called Pax Mongolica. While the great Khans warred amongst themselves, they also understood the value of trade, the lifeblood of their vast domains. This fragile peace was the razor-thin path upon which the fortunes of houses like the Polo family would be built. Meanwhile, in the West, the world was a cauldron of its own conflicts. The last gasps of the Crusader states in the Levant were being choked out by the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, closing off traditional trade routes to the east and forcing ambitious merchants to seek new, more perilous paths. In Europe itself, kingdoms were coalescing, but the continent was far from united. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of feuding princes. France and England were gearing up for the conflict that would become the 100 Years' War, and in the Mediterranean, a savage, undeclared war for commercial supremacy raged between the maritime republics of Venice and Genoa. Their galleys, filled with silks, spices, and soldiers, clashed in every major port, a conflict born of pure, unadulterated greed. This was Marco's world, a place where the Pope in Rome dreamed of converting the great Khan to Christianity to forge a grand alliance against Islam, where kings demanded ever more exotic luxuries, and where the line between a merchant, a spy, and an explorer was not just blurry, but non-existent. It was a world poised on a knife's edge, where immense risk promised unimaginable reward, a perfect storm for a family with the audacity to sail into its very heart. The story of Marco Polo does not begin on the steppes of Asia, but in the damp, salt-laced air of Venice, in the shadow of the Rialto Bridge where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a single tide. He was forged not in the crucible of battle, but in the relentless, unforgiving world of Venetian commerce. To be a Polo was to inherit a legacy of restlessness, an ancestral curse of ambition that saw the world not as a home, but as a ledger book of opportunities. His father, Niccolò, and his uncle, Maffeo, were not mere shopkeepers. They were merchant adventurers, a breed of men who thought nothing of vanishing into the East for a decade at a time, chasing rumors of gems, silks, and spices. Marco was born into this world of calculated risk, but also into a world of absence. His mother died when he was young, and his father was a ghost, a name whispered in stories of Constantinople and the Black Sea, a man he would not meet until he was a teenager. This paternal void became the furnace of his character. He grew up in the bustling, chaotic alleys of the Serenissima, a city built on water and nerve, a republic that worshipped God on Sunday and gold the rest of the week. He learned the languages of the docks, the subtle art of negotiation, the cold calculus of profit and loss. He saw firsthand the city's ruthless pragmatism, how Venice had cunningly diverted the Fourth Crusade to sack its Christian rival, Constantinople, a generation earlier, an act of commercial savagery disguised as piety. This cynical, opportunistic, and deeply curious environment shaped him. He was not a warrior or a nobleman. He was a product of a rising merchant class that was beginning to believe its wealth could buy it a status greater than any ancient bloodline. The driving force of his youth was a desperate need to prove himself worthy of the Polo name, to earn a place beside the father and uncle who were more legend than family. It was a hunger not just for riches, but for the stories, the experiences, the sheer knowledge of the world that his family trafficked in as their most precious commodity. This restless, observant, and quietly ambitious boy was waiting for his chance to step out of the shadow of his family's legacy and into the vast, terrifying, and brilliant light of the unknown world. The first step into the great game was not a dramatic stride, but a quiet, fateful decision made in the heart of the Polo household in the year 1271. Niccolò and Maffeo Polo had returned to Venice a few years prior from their first epic journey. Ghosts returned from the dead, bearing tales of a potentate in the east, a great Khan named Kublai, who had asked them to carry a message to the Pope. They were meant to return with 100 wise men of the Christian faith and holy oil from the sepulchre in Jerusalem. However, the papacy was in a state of chaos, the papal throne vacant for years, and their mission had stalled. For 2 years they waited in Venice, their promises to the most powerful ruler in the world unfulfilled. It was in this period of frustrating limbo that the decision was made. They would go back. They had to. To fail to return would be an insult the Khan would not forgive, closing off the East to them forever. And this time, they would take someone with them. The now 17-year-old Marco, the boy his father had left behind. The boy who had grown into a young man with his father's eyes and an insatiable hunger for the world beyond the Venetian lagoon. This was the moment his life truly began. The sensory assault of that departure must have been overwhelming for a youth who had known only Venice. The creak of the ship's timbers, the shouts of the sailors in a dozen languages, the smell of tar and salt and exotic spices already loading into the hull, the sight of the familiar campanile of St. Mark's sinking below the horizon. This was a leap into a void. They were not sailing to a known port of call like Alexandria or Acre. They were heading for the edge of the map, for lands that, in the European imagination, were populated by dog-headed men, giant ants that guarded gold, and the mythical Christian king, Prester John. This decision was Marco's baptism by fire, an irreversible commitment. For his father and uncle, it was a calculated risk based on prior experience. For Marco, it was a pure act of faith. Faith in his family, whom he barely knew, and faith in the existence of a world he could only dream of. The journey ahead would be a brutal education, a 3.5-year odyssey through treacherous mountains, scorching deserts, and lands ruled by warring tribes. It was this first step, this departure from the familiar, that began the process of transforming the Venetian boy into a citizen of the world, a man who would learn to see with different eyes. Beneath the veneer of a dutiful son, accompanying his father and uncle on a commercial venture, a deeper, more secret fire burned within Marco Polo. This was not merely a quest for the ducats and bezants that made the Venetian world turn. The true, hidden motivation was an almost scholarly, deeply personal, and insatiable curiosity that bordered on obsession. While Niccolò and Maffeo saw the world as a series of markets and opportunities, Marco saw it as a tapestry of cultures, languages, and customs to be meticulously observed and recorded. He possessed an almost unique mind for his time, less that of a merchant and more that of an ethnographer and intelligence agent. He was driven by a relentless need to know, to understand how different peoples lived, what gods they worshipped, what laws they obeyed, what they ate, what they wore, and what stories they told. This was his inner demon, the insatiable hunger for information. As they journeyed eastward through Persia, across the desolate Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, and into the vast deserts of the Taklamakan, it was Marco who was constantly observing questioning and mentally cataloging everything he saw. He noted the way Zoroastrians tended their sacred fires, the customs of the Nestorians Christians they encountered, the strange traditions of shamanistic tribes. This was a man collecting data with a fervor that went far beyond commercial necessity. Furthermore, this journey was his chance to finally forge a bond with the father who had been a phantom for the first 15 years of his life. Every mountain pass crossed, every hardship endured, was a shared experience that slowly built a bridge between them. He was desperate to prove to Niccolo that he was more than just cargo, that he possessed the grit, the intelligence, and the observational skills that were the true currency of their trade. This desire for paternal approval, combined with his innate and profound curiosity, created a powerful engine that drove him forward, pushing him to see more, learn more, and remember more than any European before him. He was not just traveling to get to China. He was traveling to consume the world with his senses and his mind, to build a library of experiences in his head that would one day become his greatest treasure and his heaviest burden. The culmination of their 3.5-year trek across Asia was the fateful encounter that would utterly redefine Marco Polo's life. In the summer of 1275, the weary travelers finally arrived at the summer palace of Kublai Khan in Chengdu, a place that would later be immortalized in the Western imagination as Xanadu. The sensory shock of this arrival is almost impossible to overstate. After years in the harsh, desolate landscapes of Central Asia, they stepped into a world of impossible order and opulence. The air itself would have smelled different, of exotic flowers, burning incense, and the clean scent of meticulously tended gardens, a stark contrast to the filth of medieval European cities. The sounds would have been a symphony of the unfamiliar, the gentle tinkle of wind chimes, the murmur of officials speaking Mongolian, Turkic, and Chinese, the soft shuffle of silk slippers on polished wood. Visually, it was a kaleidoscope of vibrant colors, lacquered pavilions, gilded roofs, guardsmen in brilliant silk uniforms. This was not the rough-hewn court of a barbarian chieftain. It was the heart of a sophisticated, cosmopolitan empire. And at its center was the man himself, Kublai Khan, grandson of the great Genghis, lord of the Yuan dynasty, and arguably the most powerful man on the planet. He was no longer a young warrior, but a man in his 60s, yet his presence was overwhelming. Marco would have seen a figure of immense gravitas, his face a mask of imperial calm, his eyes holding the wisdom and weariness of a man who ruled over a domain stretching from the Yellow Sea to the borders of Poland. This was the moment of judgment. The Polos, dusty and travel-worn, presented themselves before the Khan, explaining their long delay and their failure to bring the 100 Christian scholars he had requested. But instead of anger, the Khan showed curiosity, particularly towards the young Marco, now a man of 21 who had mastered several of the languages of the empire along their journey. The Khan, a shrewd judge of men and an astute ruler who valued capable administrators regardless of their origin, saw something in the young Venetian's sharp eyes and quick mind. This was not just a meeting, it was an audition. And in that moment, Marco Polo passed. The Khan took him into his service, a decision that would grant Marco unprecedented access to the innermost workings of the Mongol Empire and seal his fate for the next 17 years. He had arrived at the court of the great Khan as a merchant's son and would now become the emperor's eyes and ears. Once accepted into the great Khan's service, Marco Polo began a new life, one that bore no resemblance to the mercantile existence he had been groomed for. The price of the Khan's trust was absolute loyalty and relentless diligence. and Marco paid it in full. Kublai Khan was a ruler who, despite his Mongol heritage, presided over a deeply complex and ancient Chinese civilization. He was a foreign conqueror ruling a sophisticated and often resentful populace, and he deeply distrusted his Chinese officials. Consequently, he built his administration on a foundation of foreigners, Persians, Arabs, Turks, and now a Venetian. He saw in Marco an ideal agent, a man with no local allegiances, utterly dependent on the Khan's favor, and possessing a keen, outsider's perspective. Marco's first tasks were likely modest, but he quickly proved his value. He had a gift for languages, rapidly acquiring a working knowledge of Persian, a lingua franca of the Silk Road and the Mongol court, and likely some Mongolian and Turkic dialects. His greatest asset, however, was his meticulous power of observation. The Khan began sending him on missions to the far-flung provinces of his empire, to regions like Yunnan and Tibet, places few outsiders had ever seen. Marco's role was not that of a mere messenger. He was an imperial inspector, an ethnographer, a tax assessor, and a spy. He traveled with the authority of the Khan, bearing a golden paisa, a tablet of command that granted him safe passage, fresh horses, and lodging throughout the empire's remarkably efficient postal system. On these journeys, he did more than just relay the Khan's orders. He observed and memorized everything: the local customs, the agricultural products, the types of currency used, the presence of Christian or Muslim communities, the state of the roads and bridges, and any signs of rebellion or discontent. Upon his return to court, he would deliver his official report, and then, knowing the Khan's thirst for novelty, he would regale him with detailed, colorful stories of the strange and wonderful things he had seen. Unlike his other officials who gave dry, bureaucratic accounts, Marco was a storyteller. He understood that information was power, but that information presented as a captivating narrative was influence. He was becoming the emperor's eyes and ears, painting a picture of the vast realm for a ruler who could not see it all himself. This was how he rose, not through wealth or warfare, but through the power of his observant mind and his tongue, becoming an indispensable tool for the master of the Yuan dynasty. The great antagonist of Marco Polo's story was not a single person, not a rival merchant or a scheming court official. The true adversary was an idea, a colossal and overwhelming reality: the Mongol world order and the sheer scale of the civilization it governed. This was a force so vast, so sophisticated, and so utterly alien to the European mindset that it constituted a psychological barrier, a conceptual wall that would later prove impossible for his countrymen to climb. When Marco described the empire of the Great Khan, he was not just describing a kingdom. He was describing a different plane of existence. The city of Kambaluk, modern Beijing, the Khan's winter capital, was a meticulously planned metropolis, its streets laid out in a perfect grid, a concept of urban planning unknown in the chaotic, winding alleys of Venice or Paris. Its population numbered in the millions when London was a town of perhaps 40,000. The empire's infrastructure was a marvel of engineering. The Grand Canal, a waterway stretching for over 1,000 miles, connected the agricultural heartland of the south with the political center in the north, a logistical feat that dwarfed any public work in Europe. The Imperial Postal Service, with its tens of thousands of relay stations and hundreds of thousands of horses, could transmit messages across the continent with a speed that seemed almost supernatural to a European accustomed to news traveling at the pace of a man on foot. This was the macro-level threat to the European worldview, the dawning, terrifying realization that Christendom was not the center of the world, but a small, fractious, and relatively primitive peninsula on the western edge of a continent dominated by a far greater power. This reality challenged the very foundations of European identity, its sense of cultural and religious superiority. The antagonist was the fact of a well-ordered, prosperous, and powerful society that functioned perfectly well without the Pope, without feudal knights, and without the precepts of Roman law. Marco's meticulous descriptions of this world, its paper money, its social welfare systems for the poor, its religious tolerance, were not just travelers' tales. They were an unintentional and devastating critique of his own society. The Dragon of the East did not need to breathe fire. Its mere existence was enough to scorch the fragile ego of the European eagle. As Marco's favor with the great Khan grew, so did his responsibilities, and he received his first taste of real, intoxicating power, along with its bitter, corrosive aftertaste. According to his own account, a claim that remains one of the most debated aspects of his story, he was appointed as a governor or high official in the great city of Yangzhou for a period of 3 years. Yangzhou was a major center for salt production and trade, a vital source of revenue for the imperial government, and placing a foreigner in charge of it would have been consistent with Kublai Khan's policy of using outsiders in key administrative roles to prevent corruption and regional power building among his Chinese subjects. For Marco, this was the pinnacle of his career in China. He went from being an observer to a participant, from a chronicler to a ruler. The sensory experience would have been one of profound immersion. He would have lived in an official's palace, surrounded by servants, petitioners, and the constant hum of a massive administrative machine. He would have traded his dusty traveler's robes for the fine silks of a yuan official, his days filled not with the hardships of the road, but with the complexities of tax collection, legal disputes, and infrastructure management. This was the moment he truly understood the machinery of the empire from the inside. However, this power came with a heavy psychological burden. He was a Venetian Christian ruling over a Chinese populace that likely viewed him with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and deep-seated resentment. He was an agent of a foreign, conquering power. Every decision he made, every tax he levied, every judgment he passed, reinforced his status as an outsider and an instrument of Mongol rule. This is where the moral compromises would have begun. To govern effectively, he would have had to enforce the Khan's laws, which were not always just, and to navigate the treacherous currents of court politics, where a single misstep could mean disgrace or death. The fatal seduction of this power was that it isolated him further, cutting him off from his own identity. He was no longer just a Polo of Venice. He was an official of the great Khan. This experience was crucial, for it gave his later testimony the weight of authority, but it also marked a point of no return. He had seen how the world was managed from the very top, and the knowledge was a form of exile, making it impossible for him to ever truly go back to being a simple merchant in a world that now seemed impossibly small and provincial. Marco Polo's 17-year tenure in China was not a static period of service, but a continuous masterclass in political survival, and he learned to find opportunity in the empire's inherent chaos. The Yuan dynasty, for all its immense power and sophisticated bureaucracy, was a deeply fractured society, a cauldron of simmering tensions that an astute outsider could exploit. The primary fault line ran between the Mongol conquerors and the native Chinese population, particularly the elite scholar officials who despised the barbarians and the legion of foreign administrators, like Marco, who had usurped their traditional roles. This internal conflict created a paranoid, intrigue-filled environment in the court and regional administrations. Marco, As a foreigner who was not part of the powerful Central Asian Muslim faction or the ambitious Tibetan Lamist circles, occupied a unique niche. He was a free agent, his loyalty only to the Khan himself, which made him both useful and vulnerable. He learned to navigate this treacherous world by becoming an indispensable source of untainted information. He could travel to a province and report on the activities of a local Mongol governor or a Chinese administrator without being suspected of favoring one faction over another. He turned his foreignness from a liability into his greatest asset. Furthermore, he witnessed firsthand the immense cultural and economic diversity of the empire and the challenges the Khan faced in trying to impose a unified rule. He saw the friction between the pastoral, nomadic lifestyle of the Mongols and the settled, agrarian society of the Chinese. He observed the complex web of religious communities, Buddhists, Taoists, Nestorian Christians, Muslims, all vying for influence and favor. In this chaotic tapestry, Marco found his role. He was not just an administrator. He was a political analyst, providing the Khan with the kind of ground-level intelligence that was essential for holding such a vast and disparate empire together. He used the chaos as his camouflage and his ladder. While others were consumed by their own power struggles, he remained focused on his mission of observation and reporting, a strategy that ensured his continued value to the aging emperor. This ability to thrive amidst the systemic instability of the Yuan dynasty was perhaps his most remarkable skill, allowing him to see and document a society that was in a constant state of flux, a society whose deep internal contradictions would ultimately lead to its downfall not long after he departed. The absolute climax of Marco Polo's experience, the memory that would shine brightest and cast the longest, most unbelievable shadow upon his return, was his time in the city of Kinsai, modern-day Hangzhou. This was not just a city. In the European imagination, it was a myth, a place they would later call the City of Heaven. For Marco, arriving there was the greatest triumph of his senses. After the rugged, masculine grandeur of the Mongol capitals in the north, Kinsai was a vision of refined, almost decadent beauty, a sensory explosion that assaulted him from every direction. The first impression would have been of water and light. The city was a labyrinth of canals, crisscrossed by, as he famously claimed, 12,000 bridges, a number so vast it became a symbol of his supposed exaggeration. The sound was not of horses and carts on cobblestones, but the gentle lapping of water, the rhythmic splash of thousands of oars from pleasure barges and merchant vessels, and the murmur of a population that exceeded 1 million souls. The air was thick with the scent of blossoming lotus flowers from the West Lake, the tantalizing aroma of street food being cooked on every corner, and the delicate perfume worn by its inhabitants. Visually, it was overwhelming. He described vast public squares, markets overflowing with silks, porcelain, and spices from across the world, and luxurious palaces with sweeping, tiled roofs. He spoke of immense public baths where citizens could relax for hours, and of barges so ornately decorated they were floating palaces, complete with gardens and banquet halls. This was a spectacle of civic order, commercial vibrancy, and aesthetic pleasure that had no parallel in the West. He described a city with a professional fire brigade, paved streets, and a system of social welfare, all concepts that would have sounded like pure fantasy to a resident of 13th century London or Paris. Kinsai was the ultimate proof of the antagonist, the sheer, undeniable sophistication of this other world. It was his greatest triumph because it was the most potent and undeniable piece of evidence he possessed. The memory of Kinsai, with its shimmering canals and endless bridges, would become the jewel of his narrative, the single most incredible story he had to tell. It was also, tragically, the story that would most thoroughly convince his listeners that he was not a witness, but a madman. At the zenith of his 17-year immersion in the East, standing amidst the impossible splendors of Kinsai, or walking the hallowed halls of the Khan's palace in Cambaluc, Marco Polo underwent a profound psychological transformation. This was his moment of hubris, but it was not the hubris of arrogance. It was the hubris of a witness. He no longer saw himself as merely a Venetian merchant or even as a servant of the Khan. He began to perceive himself as an instrument of destiny, a man chosen by Providence to see these wonders, and crucially, to be the conduit through which this knowledge would be revealed to the ignorant West. He was the sole keeper of a world-altering truth. In his own mind, he was no longer just collecting information for his patron. He was building an archive for posterity. Every detail he committed to memory: the burning of black stones for fuel, the use of paper currency, the complex workings of the salt monopoly, the religious rituals of the Taoists, was a precious artifact he was mentally carrying back to his own civilization. He saw his triumph not in the wealth he might accumulate or the favor he enjoyed, but in the sheer, unparalleled scope of his experience. He had seen the world in its true proportions and understood, as no European before him, the humbling reality of his own culture's place within it. This knowledge gave him a sense of profound, almost isolating superiority. He was a man from the future, returning to the past. He imagined his homecoming, the awe with which his stories would be received, the way kings and popes would hang on his every word, the fame and respect that would eclipse that of any other traveler. This was the psychology of a man who believed he held the key to a new age of enlightenment. He saw his journey as a sacred duty to enlighten the darkness of European ignorance. This sense of mission, this belief in the monumental importance of his own testimony, is what sustained him through the remaining years of his service and the perilous journey home. It was also the very thing that set him up for his devastating fall. He was so utterly convinced of the power of the truth he carried that he never conceived of the possibility that the world he was returning to would be utterly incapable of receiving it. The most crucial encounter of Marco Polo's later life was not with a king or an emperor, but with a fellow prisoner in the squalor of a Genoese jail. His name was Rustichello of Pisa, and he was the sworn enemy who became the unlikely midwife to Marco's legacy. After his return to Venice and his subsequent capture in a naval skirmish, Marco found himself locked away with this paisan, a man from a city that was a bitter rival of both Venice and Genoa. Rustichello was not a merchant or a warrior. He was a writer, a professional scribe, and, more importantly, a composer of Arthurian romances. His stock in trade was tales of knights, chivalry, and fantastical quests. He dealt in the currency of the believable lie, the entertaining fiction. The encounter between these two men in that prison cell was a perfect, ironic collision of worlds. On one side was Marco, a man bursting with incredible, unbelievable truths about a real world he had witnessed. On the other was Rustichello, a man skilled in crafting plausible, entertaining fictions about an imaginary world. The chemistry between them was one of complementary opposition. Marco possessed the content, the greatest travel story in human history. But he was a merchant, a practical man, not a polished storyteller. Rustichello possessed the craft, the ability to structure a narrative, to add dramatic flair, and to write in the Franco-Italian language that was popular for such tales at the time. As Marco began to recount his memories, not to boast, but perhaps simply to pass the grueling hours of imprisonment and to unburden a mind overflowing with 2 decades of unshared experience. Rustichello did not hear the ravings of a liar. He heard the raw material for the greatest romance ever told. He recognized the epic scope, the exotic locales, the powerful emperor, the perilous journeys. He saw that Marco's truth was far more spectacular than any fiction he could ever invent. It was Rustichello who likely insisted on structuring the narrative, on giving it a title, the description of the world, and on ensuring it was written down. He became Marco's first and most important audience. He was the one who saw that the story's value lay not in its utility as a merchant's guide, but in its power as a pure, breathtaking narrative. Their collaboration was a strange alchemy of fact and art, a partnership forged in a dungeon between enemies that gave birth to a book that would change the course of history. Beyond the shimmering silks, precious gems, and exotic spices that captivated the European imagination, Marco Polo's narrative was revolutionary for its description of the mundane miracles, the everyday machinery of a sophisticated empire that were, in many ways, more wondrous than any palace of gold. These were the onions and vegetables of his story, the contextual details that revealed the true depth of the Yuan dynasty's advancement. Chief among these was the concept of paper money. Marco described with the meticulous detail of a merchant how the great Khan could produce currency from the bark of mulberry trees, stamping it with his official seal and making it legal tender throughout his vast domain. He explained the system of exchange for old notes and the severe, often fatal punishment for counterfeiting. To a Europe still laboriously trading in heavy, irregularly weighted coins of gold and silver, this idea of a government creating wealth from paper seemed not just fantastical, but like a form of sorcery, a dangerous and incomprehensible fraud. Then there was the matter of black stones that burn. He detailed how the Chinese would dig a type of black rock from the ground, coal, and burn it for fuel, providing a cheap and abundant source of heat that kept their homes warm throughout the winter. This was a revelation to a continent still reliant on rapidly dwindling forests for its firewood. He marveled at the empire's communication network, the YAM system, an imperial post that was so efficient it could deliver a message from the capital to a distant city in a matter of days, a journey that might take months in Europe. He also spoke of things that seemed to be minor curiosities, but hinted at a deeper scientific understanding, such as the use of asbestos cloth that could be cleaned by putting it in a fire, and the use of the compass for navigation, a technology that was still in its infancy in the Mediterranean. These details, far from being boring, were the most powerful evidence of a society operating on a different technological and organizational level. They were the practical, verifiable proofs of his claims, yet for many, they were just as unbelievable as the 12,000 bridges of Kinsai, further cementing the perception that his entire account was a fabrication from beginning to end. Woven into the grand tapestry of Marco's epic descriptions of empires and economies are the subtle, often unspoken threads of his personal life, the context of family, faith, and the role of women that remains largely shrouded in mystery. For 17 years, he lived as a young man growing into middle age within the cosmopolitan, and in many ways remarkably liberal, society of the Mongol court. While his book is famously reticent on the subject of his own relationships, he provides tantalizing glimpses into a world where women, particularly Mongol women, wielded a level of influence and autonomy unheard of in his native Venice. He described the powerful wives and mothers of the Khans, who managed vast households, controlled immense wealth, and often acted as kingmakers in the brutal succession struggles that followed a ruler's death. He noted the customs of marriage, the practice of polygamy among the elite, and the relative freedom with which women could move about in society, a stark contrast to the more cloistered lives of their European counterparts. The question of Marco's own family life during this period is a void at the center of his narrative. Did he take a wife, as many foreign officials in the Khan's service did? Did he have children who were left behind when he finally departed? His silence on this matter is profound and has led to endless speculation. It may have been a painful memory he chose to omit, or perhaps a practical decision to avoid complicating his status upon his return to Christian Venice. Similarly, he rarely speaks of his own faith. He catalogues the various religions of the empire, Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Nestorianism, with an ethnographer's detached curiosity, but he gives little insight into his own spiritual struggles. Maintaining his Catholic faith in a world where it was a tiny, insignificant minority must have been a profound challenge, a quiet, internal battle fought over 17 years. These personal details, or the lack thereof, are not trivial. They highlight the immense cultural gulf he straddled, the parts of his life he had to compartmentalize or sacrifice. He was a man living entirely outside his own cultural context, a reality that must have been both liberating and deeply isolating, and which ultimately contributed to the sense of alienation he would feel upon his return. After more than a decade of favor and prosperity, the first cracks began to appear in the golden cage that had become Marco Polo's life. The harbingers of the coming storm were subtle at first, but they signaled a dangerous shift in the political climate of the Yuan dynasty. The primary source of this instability was the advancing age of his patron, Kublai Khan. The once vigorous emperor was now past 70, increasingly afflicted by gout and sinking into periods of depression and paranoia, particularly after the devastating failures of his naval invasions of Japan. His grip on the vast empire, while still firm, was beginning to weaken, and the ever-present question of succession loomed over the court like a thundercloud. The death of the Khan's favorite son and chosen heir, Zhenjin, plunged the emperor into a deep grief from which he never truly recovered, and it threw the court into a chaos of political maneuvering as his other sons and grandsons began to vie for power. This created a perilous environment for foreign officials like the Polos. Their position and safety were entirely dependent on the personal favor of Kublai. A new Khan might not share his predecessor's cosmopolitan outlook and could easily purge the administration of the foreigners his grandfather had relied upon. Compounding this was a rising tide of xenophobia among the native Chinese scholar officials, who had long resented the privileges granted to outsiders. As the Khan's health failed, their voices grew louder, arguing for a return to traditional Confucian governance and the expulsion of foreign adventurers. The Polos began to feel a growing sense of unease. They had amassed a considerable fortune in jewels and gold, but they realized it was worthless if they could not take it home. They had been in China for 17 years, and the dream of seeing Venice again, which had once seemed a distant goal, now became an urgent, gnawing desire. They repeatedly petitioned the Khan for permission to leave, but he had grown fond of them and valued their service, and he refused their requests each time. The world that had once been a universe of opportunity was slowly transforming into a luxurious prison, and they began to grasp the terrifying possibility that they might die of old age in this foreign land, their bones buried thousands of miles from home. The fateful act that provided the Polos with their one desperate chance for escape came not as a covert plan, but as an official and extremely perilous imperial mission. The Ilkhan of Persia, Arghun, who was Kublai Khan's great-nephew, had lost his favorite wife and, according to Mongol tradition, had sent envoys to the great Khan's court to request a new bride from her same lineage. A 17-year-old Mongol princess named Kokochin was chosen. The overland journey back to Persia, however, was now deemed too dangerous due to wars that had broken out between the Mongol Khanates in Central Asia. The Persian envoys, having met the famous Polos at court and heard of their extensive maritime experience, proposed a radical solution. They would return to Persia by sea, and they requested that the 3 Venetians, known for their knowledge and reliability, accompany them to ensure the princess's safety. For the Polos, this was a moment of supreme, terrifying opportunity. They immediately understood that this was their only way out, a legitimate reason to leave China that the Khan could not easily refuse. The psychology of their decision was a mixture of desperation and calculation. They would be entrusting their lives and fortune to the treacherous waters of the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, a voyage far more dangerous than their overland journey. Yet the alternative, remaining in China to face the uncertainties of a post-Kublai court, seemed even riskier. They pressed the case to the aging Khan, arguing that their expertise was essential for the mission's success. Reluctantly, Kublai agreed, seeing the logic in the request, and perhaps realizing he could not hold on to his favorite foreigners forever. He outfitted a fleet of 14 massive Chinese junks, provisioned them for 2 years, and gave the Polos his blessing, along with letters for the kings of Europe and the Pope. This decision was the pivot upon which their entire story turned. It was a gamble of the highest order, an exchange of the gilded security of the Khan's court for a death sentence on the open ocean. It was a choice born of the primal human instinct to return home, a choice that would lead them into the greatest catastrophe of their entire 24-year odyssey. The voyage to escort Princess Kokochin to Persia was not the triumphant homecoming the Polos had dreamed of, but their greatest catastrophe, a 2-year descent into a maritime hell that stands as one of the most harrowing sea journeys ever recorded. The epic description of this ordeal in Marco's book is a stark contrast to the opulence of the Khan's court. The sensory assault began almost immediately. The fleet of 14 great junks, carrying over 600 people, not including the sailors, departed from the port of Zaitun, Guangzhou, and sailed into the vast, unpredictable expanse of the ocean of monsters. The initial leg of the journey through the South China Sea and past Vietnam and the Malay Peninsula was a grueling battle against monsoons. Imagine the inhuman hum of the wind in the rigging, a sound that would last for weeks on end, the violent lurch and sickening roll of the massive ships in towering waves, and the constant chilling creak of the timbers straining against the sea's fury. The smell would have been of salt water, tar, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present stench of seasickness and disease. They made stops in Sumatra, where they were delayed for months by unfavorable winds, and in Ceylon and along the coast of India. It was on this long, slow crawl across the Indian Ocean that the true catastrophe unfolded. Disease, likely scurvy and cholera, ravaged the passengers and crew. Death became a daily ritual. Marco describes a voyage where the vibrant, crowded ships that left China slowly transformed into floating charnel houses. Of the estimated 600 members of the courtly entourage that set out, only 18 survived the journey, a staggering mortality rate. The princess herself and one of her ladies-in-waiting were among the few who lived. The Polos, hardened by years of travel and perhaps blessed with incredible luck, were also among the survivors. This ordeal was the brutal price of their freedom. It stripped away the last vestiges of the protected life they had known under the Khan's rule, and thrust them back into a world of raw, untamable nature. The experience was a grim, final lesson in the realities of the world outside the Pax Mongolica, a brutal reminder that for all the sophistication of the East, the journey between civilizations was still a gamble against death. After surviving the hellish sea voyage and successfully delivering the princess to Persia, only to find that her intended husband, Arghun Khan, had died, and she was to be married to his son instead, the Polos finally made their way overland to the Black Sea and took a ship to Venice. They arrived in the year 1295, 24 years after they had departed. The psychological collapse they experienced upon their return was almost as devastating as the catastrophe at sea. They were ghosts returning to a city that had long ago given them up for dead. The Venice they had left was not the Venice that greeted them. Friends and family were gone, their old home had been sold, and their own relatives failed to recognize these three figures, clad in ragged Mongol-style clothing, their faces weathered by sun and hardship, speaking a Venetian dialect thick with foreign cadences. They were aliens in their own home. The legendary story of their return, perhaps embellished over time, claims that to prove their identity, they hosted a grand banquet. They appeared in their rough Tartar robes, then changed into fine silks, and finally, they took their original coarse garments and with knives slit the seams. Out poured a river of jewels, rubies, sapphires, diamonds, and emeralds, a fortune beyond imagining that they had sewn into their clothing. This display convinced their family of their identity, but it did a deeper, more lasting damage to their credibility. It framed them not as witnesses, but as fabulists, as men from the world of Oriental fantasy. When they began to tell their true stories, not just of wealth, but of the vast, ordered civilization they had left behind, they were met not with awe, but with derision and disbelief. Their tales of paper money, burning rocks, and cities with thousands of bridges were dismissed as the ravings of madmen or the elaborate lies of showmen. The very scale of their truth was its own undoing. They were mocked in the streets, becoming local curiosities, the gentlemen of a million lies. This was the ultimate collapse. To have survived deserts, mountains, oceans, and the intrigue of a foreign court, only to be defeated by the small, closed minds of their own people. The world they had risked everything to see was a world their own city refused to believe existed. The final scene of Marco Polo's life, as recorded by tradition, is the ultimate cinematic finale, bringing his entire story full circle with a quiet, defiant roar. It is the year 1324. He is an old man of 70, lying on his deathbed in his home in Venice. The room is likely dark, filled with the scent of candles and the murmuring of a priest who has come to deliver the last rites. His family and friends are gathered around, their faces etched with a mixture of concern, pity, and a final pleading urgency. For decades, he has lived with the nickname Il Milione, the man of a million lies. His book, The Description of the World, has circulated, but it is largely regarded as a fantastic romance, a collection of entertaining fables, not a work of geography or a true account. The priest, leaning in close, his voice a sibilant whisper, implores Marco to save his immortal soul. "Confess," he urges. "Recant the fictions and fabrications you have told, and God will forgive you." This is the final temptation, to surrender to the world's disbelief, to admit it was all a dream, and to die in the comforting embrace of conformity. In this moment, all the years of mockery, all the whispers and ridicule, coalesce into a single point. But Marco, summoning his last ounce of strength, pushes himself up and looks into the faces around him. His voice is weak, but his words are forged from the steel of absolute conviction. "I have not told," he rasps, "half of what I saw." With that final act of defiance, he closes his eyes. This was his last testament. He died not as a penitent liar, but as a frustrated witness, a man whose reality was simply too vast for his era to comprehend. His finale was not a recantation, but a powerful reaffirmation of his truth, a final, tantalizing hint that the wonders he had described were but a pale shadow of the full, unbelievable reality he carried within him. It was a perfect, tragic end for a man who had seen everything but could convince almost no one. He chose to die with his truth, leaving it to future generations to vindicate his name. The legacy of Marco Polo is a profound conflict of interpretations, a story of how a single text can be refracted through the prisms of different needs and desires, ultimately shaping the world in ways its author could never have imagined. Immediately after its creation, his book, The Description of the World, began a double life. For the vast majority of the public, it was received as a magnificent work of fantasy, a picaresque romance no more real than the tales of King Arthur. It was copied and read alongside epic poems and fables, its descriptions of Cambaluc and Kinsay treated as magical realms, not real places. It fed the European appetite for the exotic and the monstrous, confirming their preconceived notions of the Orient as a land of inexplicable wonders and immense fairy tale wealth. For this audience, Marco was il milione, a masterful entertainer. However, a second, more serious audience slowly began to emerge. For the hard-nosed merchants of Venice and Genoa, the book was not a romance, but a revolutionary business manual. They sifted through the fables to find priceless commercial intelligence. Where the best spices grew, what products were valued in which markets, the routes of the great caravans, and the political stability of various regions. They created practical, stripped-down versions of the manuscript, focusing on weights, measures, currencies, and distances. For them, Marco was not a liar, but a brilliant scout who had mapped the future of global trade. Then, a third interpretation arose among a small but influential group of cartographers and explorers. They began to suspect that behind the alleged exaggerations lay a framework of geographical truth. Mapmakers in Catalonia and Italy started to incorporate Marco's descriptions, cautiously adding details to the vast, empty spaces on their maps of Asia. His book was a primary source for the famous Catalan Atlas of 1375, which depicted a far more detailed and accurate vision of the continent. This was Marco the geographer, the man who, piece by piece, was redrawing the known world from a prison cell. The ultimate vindication of this interpretation would come over a century and a half later, when a Genoese navigator, obsessed with finding a westward sea route to the riches Marco had described, set sail with a heavily annotated copy of the book in his personal library. That man was Christopher Columbus. For him, Marco was not a liar or a merchant, but a prophet, the man who had provided the map to a new world. We finally arrive at the solution to the central paradox: how a man who saw the world was condemned for his vision, and what, precisely, broke him. Marco Polo was not broken by a political enemy, by the hardships of his journey, or by a fatal character flaw in the traditional sense. He was broken by the sheer, crushing weight of the truth he carried and the profound inadequacy of his audience. He was a man who had witnessed a paradigm shift, who had seen a civilization in the East that was in many ways more advanced, more populous, and better organized than his own. He returned to a Europe that was proud, insular, and deeply convinced of its own theological and cultural superiority. The truth he presented was not just a collection of interesting facts. It was a fundamental challenge to his world's entire conception of itself. His stories implicitly suggested that Christendom was not the apex of civilization, that a powerful and just empire could exist outside the influence of the Catholic Church. This was a truth so destabilizing, so contrary to the established order, that it was easier for his contemporaries to dismiss the messenger as a liar than to grapple with the terrifying implications of the message. He became a prisoner of his own wonder. Every marvel he described, from paper money to the vastness of Kinsai, served only to deepen the moat of disbelief around him. His problem was one of scale and imagination. He was trying to describe a widescreen, technicolor reality to an audience that had only ever known a small, monochrome world. They lacked the context, the vocabulary, and most importantly, the willingness to comprehend what he was telling them. The more truthfully he spoke, the more fantastical he sounded. In the end, what broke him was not the prison in Genoa, but the larger prison of his era's limited worldview. He was a man out of time, a harbinger of a globalized consciousness arriving centuries too early. The tragedy of Marco Polo is that he successfully bridged the physical distance between East and West, only to discover an even greater, unbridgeable chasm in the human mind. The distance between an extraordinary experience and the capacity of others to believe it. The universal lesson of Marco Polo's life, the verdict of history, is a profound meditation on the nature of truth, the painful birth of a global perspective, and the eternal struggle between the individual visionary and the collective imagination. His saga is not merely the story of a single adventurous merchant. It is a timeless parable about the clash of civilizations, not on a battlefield, but in the realm of ideas. He represents the disruptive power of new information, the way a single, first-hand account can shatter centuries of myth and prejudice. His journey was the first tremor of globalization, the moment when two disparate worlds, Europe and China, were suddenly and irrevocably brought into focus through the eyes of one man. His life demonstrates that the world is always larger, more complex, and more wondrous than any single culture is willing to admit. The resistance he faced reveals a fundamental human tendency, the instinct to reject truths that challenge our comfortable, established narratives. It is often easier to ridicule the messenger than to rebuild one's own worldview. Furthermore, his story is a testament to the unpredictable power of a written account. A book dictated in a prison cell by a man considered a liar went on to redraw maps, inspire merchants, and, most consequentially, to fuel the dreams of the Age of Discovery. It proves that a story, once told, takes on a life of its own, and its true impact may not be felt for generations. The ultimate lesson is that the world is changed not only by conquerors and kings, but by witnesses, by those who dare to venture beyond the horizon and have the courage to report back what they have seen, even at the cost of their own reputation. Marco Polo's life was a struggle not against storms or bandits, but against the limitations of the human imagination. His ultimate victory was not that he was believed in his own lifetime, but that his lies became the foundation upon which a new, more accurate map of the world was eventually built. The final frame, the image that lingers long after the story is told, is not of a palace or a prison, but of a dusty, forgotten map in a dark European library, sometime in the late 14th century. The map is a typical T&O construction of its time, a disk of the world with Jerusalem at its center, surrounded by a great ocean. Europe is detailed, the Mediterranean a familiar shape. But to the east, beyond the Holy Land, the map dissolves into a realm of fantasy and conjecture labeled "Here be dragons." It is a map of ignorance, a cartography of fear. Then, a hand enters the frame and places a book beside the map. It is a copy of The Description of the World. The hand opens the book, and as the pages turn, a faint light begins to emanate from them, a warm, golden glow. This light does not illuminate the room, but it begins to project a new map over the old one. The vague shapes of the East sharpen into focus. The names of Cathay and Kinsai appear. Mountain ranges and rivers materialize where once there was only blank parchment. The book is an unlit lantern, filled with the fuel of an unbelievable truth, waiting for centuries. The light it projects is still faint, a ghost of a new reality that most cannot yet see. The book sits there, a promise and a puzzle, waiting for a future hand. The hand of a Columbus or a Vasco da Gama, to have the audacity to pick up the lantern, strike the flint of discovery, and ignite a flame that will not just illuminate the map, but set the entire old world on fire. The shadow of Marco Polo is long, and it points steadfastly, stubbornly east.